American history changed on September 11, 2001. An entire generation will remember where they were on that tragic day. An aircrew from the 133rd Airlift Wing of the Minnesota Air National Guard played a unique and unexpected role as eyewitnesses to events. Through the windows of their C-130, they saw the attack on the Pentagon, and then they flew near where United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in rural Pennsylvania, just as a civilian aircraft disappeared from radar. Quality Assurance Officer and Pilot Major Robert Schumacher was the co-pilot flying aircraft 1006. Major, please go ahead and tell us your story about September 11th,
Sure.
starting with September 10th.
Okay. Well, we were in the process of returning home from a mission, and we'd spent Monday night, September 10th, at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. On the morning of the 11th, we were scheduled for takeoff at 10 o'clock local time. We ended up being able to take off about a half an hour early. So our pre-flight duties put us out at the airplane about 9 o'clock, and we didn't have any idea at that point what was happening in New York City. We took off out of Andrews, and our departure routing put us on a westward heading at up to 4,000 feet. It was just a few minutes after takeoff. We had just passed the national airport off to the south when we first saw this airplane. It was at our 10 o'clock high position, and it looked like it was descending. We thought this was kind of weird since it was somewhat close to us, and normally the air traffic controllers will call out traffic inside of 10 miles, and I guess we were probably maybe 6 miles from it at that point. And we looked, and it wasn't showing up on our TCAS system, so we were just trying to figure out what was going on. We continued to follow the airplane, and as it continued to descend, we knew that it might be in conflict with our route of flight. It was at that point that the air traffic controller called us. He said, "Go for 6, we have unknown high-speed traffic at your 12 o'clock, do you have it in sight?" And Lieutenant Colonel Steve O'Brien responded that we did have it in sight. The controller asked us, "Can you tell us what type of an aircraft that was?" We kind of looked at each other, and then he responded, "Control, it looks like it's a 757 or 767, and it's in a right-hand turn to the east." At this point, I know we were feeling a little weird. Obviously, here was an airplane that wasn't talking to anybody. Some part of its TCAS system or its transponder was malfunctioning, and that the pilots were really just trying to fly the airplane and get it on the ground safely. I remember looking out my right side windows, kind of down on it, and just having the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and having this sinking feeling that something was going to happen. I remember thinking, God, just let him land safely. The controller called us and asked if we still had the airplane in sight, and we told him that we did, so they gave us a turn back to the east to follow the traffic. I rolled into bank right away, but things were definitely getting a little bit more strange for us. Typically, they don't keep aircraft close to an aircraft that's experiencing an emergency, and we were doing 180 knots for our climb, and obviously the airliner was doing a lot faster than this. As we made the turn, now we were facing back to the east, and had the morning sun shining at us, and there was really kind of a haze covering the ground, so it was a little more difficult to keep the airplane in sight. Lieutenant Colonel Joe DeVito was standing behind me, looking over my right shoulder. He called out that it had just crashed, and we just looked out and watched the fireball come up from the ground. Colonel O'Brien made the radio call to the controllers that the airplane had hit the ground, and there was a short pause, and then they responded, "Roger." The Pentagon is such a big building, and we were really focused in on the point of impact and the fireball and the column of smoke. So it took us several seconds, again, looking into the morning sun and having that haze. It took us several seconds to really see the shape of the building and realize that we were looking at the Pentagon. At that point, Colonel Bryan made the radio call to the controllers that the airplane had impacted into the west side of the Pentagon. The controller gave us a turn back to the west, and at this point, again, we were getting a lot closer to the Pentagon. We could see it a lot better, and we asked them if they wanted us to fly around the other side of the Pentagon or possibly orbit it to give them some type of damage report. Another pause on their part, and they came back and said negative. They needed us to turn back to the west and start a climb. So we rolled into bank. I remember looking at the pilot and looking out his windows and looking almost straight down and seeing the cars beginning to stop on the freeway that went by the Pentagon. I would say that we probably were within 1,500 feet horizontally of being directly over the Pentagon. And as soon as we got rolled wings level and headed west, Colonel Bryan started trying to find a radio station. The communication radios that we have on the airplane, some of them have the capability to tune in AM radio frequencies. And so we were trying to find a local news station, possibly hear something about what had just happened. It took us about 30 seconds to find a radio station, but as soon as we did, we started hearing reports about what was going on in New York City. It took us about a minute or so of listening to what was being said to pick up enough to realize that an airplane had flown into each of the World Trade Centers, and it was at that point that we knew that we hadn't just witnessed an accident, that we had witnessed another deliberate crash. It was amazing. The whole crew was stunned. I've flown 5 different airplanes now in my Air Force career, and I've had to deal with emergencies in each one. But I've never had a more difficult time actually flying an airplane than on that morning. During the next 15 minutes or so, the controllers continued to head us west and give us climb instructions. But while we're doing this, we listened to the radio stations and heard the reports and listened as they reported that the first World Trade Center tower had collapsed. I know that we were all just kind of feeling sick to our stomachs. I really couldn't have asked for a better crew to be with that day. We really worked together as a team. Lieutenant Colonel Steve O'Brien was the aircraft commander. Lieutenant Colonel Joe DeVito was the navigator. Master Sergeant Jeff Rosenthal was our flight engineer. And we had Master Sergeant Steve Stafford and Sergeant Robin Todd were our load masters. We also had 2 crew chiefs with us on that trip, Corey Berg and Tony Pachenko. It was probably about 20 minutes later. We were at cruise altitude at 24,000 feet when Cleveland Center gave us a call and told us that we had traffic about 30 miles in front of us. They didn't have an altitude reading on it, and they weren't talking to the airplane. We looked, but at that distance we couldn't see anything, and again, we weren't showing anything on our TCAS system. We told the controller that we didn't have it in sight, and at that point he gave us a turn to the north. And during the turn he told us that they weren't talking to the airplane and it was heading south, so they just wanted to get us away from it. It was shortly after we rolled out that Robin Todd called from the back that he could see smoke rising off our left side. We looked out our cockpit windows and spotted it immediately. Colonel O'Brien made the radio call that told him what we could see. The controller told us that they'd just lost it off their radar scope, and we verified the position with them. Turns out that we were 17 miles away from United Airlines Flight 93 when it crashed in Pennsylvania. We had a short conversation with the controller, trying to determine if it had actually crashed into the ground or if maybe it had blown up in the air. And then he gave us a turn back to the west, and our route of flight took us about 5 miles or so north of the crash site at altitude. But as we went by, we reported that we didn't see any collateral damage. It didn't appear to be any buildings in that area, that it actually looked like it was in a clearing. And it was shortly after that that we were finally given guidance to divert into Youngstown, Ohio, into the Air Force Reserve Base.